Strikers reigned in MMA for the past few years, and now wrestlers have regained the throne. Most of the champions in the UFC are grapplers of some kind of level. Alexandre Pantoja, Merab Dvalishvili, Islam Makhachev, Belal Muhammad, and Jon Jones. Valentina Shevchenko, well-rounded. Islam is as well, but she's winning a lot of her fights using her grappling. There's truly only one striker as champion in the sport, and that's Alex Pereira, who has only fought one guy who can shoot takedowns at light heavyweight. And fans aren't really happy about this, since not only are the champions predominantly grapplers, but so are some of the title challengers like Umar Nurmagomedov and Arman Tsarukyan. I would even say that they are grapplers to be accurate. They are mixed martial artists who can strike and grapple, defeating opponents who can't grapple as well as they can, so they beat them in that kind of area. Merab mostly outstruck all of his opponents, and those opponents include Sean O'Malley and Peter Yan, deemed as some of the best strikers in UFC history. That's what being well-rounded does for a fighter. The more well-rounded a fighter is, the better they will be at every aspect. Being a good wrestler can also make you an effective striker. Being a good striker can also make you an effective wrestler. A striker can develop strong grappling skills, which swings the tides of a fight in their favor. Alexander Gustafsson, Georges St. Pierre are examples of strikers who developed high-level grappling skills. But the thing is, you don't see that very often in the sport. You see a lot more wrestlers learning how to strike and then implementing both, right? Mixing both of them very well. You don't see as many strikers doing the same thing. Strikers usually just want to stay on the feet, so they only learn takedown defense, not takedown offense. But if they learn how to shoot good takedowns, their striking can absolutely make their wrestling very effective in a fight. Again, look at Gustafsson. He's a great example of a guy who went up against DC and Jon Jones, arguably out-wrestled both of them, if not evenly with them. Completely out-wrestled Jan Blachowicz. Prime Gustafsson was a prime example of a striker who learned how to wrestle well. But when you look at Sean O'Malley, for an example, he doesn't wrestle that much, right? He doesn't shoot many takedowns. He wants to just defend takedowns and stay on the feet. He's completely abandoning one whole side of the game, where guys like Merab aren't. Fighters cannot be high level if they're only focusing on either striking or grappling. They have to do both. And when I mean high level, I'm talking about championship level. Merab is doing everything. He's going to defend takedowns if you shoot on him. He's going to shoot his own takedowns to get his opponent on the ground. He'll also strike with his opponents and even go for submissions if they are there. A lot of people say Merab didn't go for any submissions. He went for 2 submissions on Sean O'Malley. A decent guillotine getting on top of O'Malley. That's what a good grappler does. Submissions are not always to try to finish the opponent. They're also to transition into better positions on top. But then when you look at Sean O'Malley, he's mostly just striking and defending takedowns and going for a few submissions himself. Like when we saw O'Malley try to wrestle Peter Yan that one time, he had a very well-timed shot. Very good takedown attempt on Peter Yan for a guy who never shoots takedowns. That was very impressive, and I was hoping to see more of that out of Sean O'Malley, but we never did. Even shooting on someone like Merab, not to commit for the takedown itself, but just to fake it for your own strikes is a huge thing that most strikers don't even do. Whether you're fighting Merab Dvalishvili or Alex Pereira, having a takedown threat is always going to give you some new tool to work with in a fight. But only wrestlers are the ones that are using that effective tool in MMA, because wrestling is not all about just shooting takedowns. Merely just changing levels could throw off any opponent, but the argument could be Merab would never fall for that, right? Merab has way better wrestling than Sean O'Malley, but he would never expect O'Malley to change levels, even if he's just faking the shot. That could throw Merab completely off guard in that moment, and O'Malley could land some sort of strike there or get a better position in the stand-up. Wrestlers do not expect strikers to shoot a takedown or even fake a takedown. When Alexander Gustafsson fought Jon Jones, in a million years, Jon Jones did not expect Gustafsson to shoot on him. And the first takedown he shot, he got him on the ground. He succeeded with it, the first fighter ever to take down Jon Jones in a fight. And it wasn't just a one-off, right? Gustafsson went on to go and show that he's able to wrestle with even Daniel Cormier, stuff the majority of Glover Teixeira's takedowns, and wrestle his way to a win against Jan Blachowicz. The sprawl and brawl strategy is starting to become outdated, but now that wrestlers know how to effectively strike, these strikers also have to learn how to offensively wrestle with their opponents. Sprawl and brawl is much harder to work now at the highest level. When we're looking at the lower weight classes, the higher weight classes, it could still work because they're a bit behind in skill level, but from 135 pounds to 155 pounds, where the best fighters are at, fighters have to become well-rounded in every aspect of fighting. And eventually those heavier weight classes are going to get better to the point where 135 to 155 is their future. Essentially, that's what they're going to look like in the next maybe 5 to 10 years. And that's why you have Tom Aspinall as the champion of the heavyweight division. He's a guy that could do everything. He's one of the few fighters in the heavier weight classes that is technical, well-rounded, and has finishing potential in every aspect of fighting. The two most prestigious weight classes are going to be dominated by wrestlers for a long time, it seems. And fans are upset at the grapplers for some reason, when it's the strikers who can't stop the takedown. You can't blame the wrestler for mixing the martial arts better than the striker, because these wrestlers are not just grappling with their opponent, they're also throwing strikes. Merab out-grappled and outstruck Sean O'Malley for most of their fight. Belal Muhammad out-grappled and outstruck Leon Edwards for most of their fight. Shevchenko outgrappled and outstruck Grasso, so it's kind of inaccurate to say that wrestling is ruining the sport. If the sport is getting ruined, which I disagree with that in general, but if the sport is getting ruined by this, it's because the strikers can't grapple as well. But there is no striker or grappler in the sport anymore. It's who is the best mixed martial artist, who can implement their mixed game in a fight. Merab did not only grapple, he also struck well. It was O'Malley who came out there one-dimensional in an MMA fight. If a fighter is one-dimensional and they get out-grappled or outstruck, it's because they just aren't as good. That's pretty much what it comes down to. In O'Malley's example, his timing on his knees were mostly off. He lost the footwork aspect, which is his best skill. He lost to the overall better fighter in nearly every aspect of MMA. If a fighter is boring, then his opponent needs to be better. End of. If Merab is spamming 1,000 takedowns to win, his opponent needs to get better with his footwork, with his wrestling, whatever he needs to do skills-wise in order not to get beat by such a simplistic game plan. Even my favorite fighter, Jose Aldo, got wall installed by Merab. And that's Aldo's fault for not having better timing on his strikes, having more output, and most frustratingly, fight better off the fence and stop looking at the ref. That was the most frustrating fight I've ever seen as a fan. Seeing my favorite fighter get stalled out for 15 minutes on the fence, but I just can't be mad at a fighter for winning. Ever. I just can't feel upset at a fighter for winning. I always look at the fighter who lost. If I'm upset at any fighter after a fight, it's always at the fighter who lost. Because if a fighter wins in a boring way, what does that say about the other fighter? How come they can't stop that approach? If a fighter is constantly spamming takedowns, there's so many openings on them, but fighters just don't capitalize on that. They don't counter that kind of fighting style. Where are their elbows in the clinch? Where are their knees in the clinch? Aldo did land some good knees. He did land some good knees to the body, but there was very little urgency from Jose Aldo, even when he was down 2 rounds. And that's actually something we didn't see in his prime. When he was in his prime, he would have a level of urgency if he was losing. But when he got older, he was just kind of content with whatever, riding out to a decision. A prime Jose Aldo against a Merab Dvalishvili, I think, would have been a very different fight. In fact, I think Jose Aldo would have won. But an old Jose Aldo, seeing him just sit on the fence for so long and only looking at the ref to get away, he didn't throw as many strikes or trying to counter Merab's aggression, except for some knees to the body. It was like, okay, I can't be mad at Merab. What is Aldo doing out there? Merab won and proved to be the better fighter, despite how boring that performance was. It's not like these boring fighting styles lasted forever. There have been fighters who were able to beat it. But regardless, these arguments aren't anything new. Fans used to complain about GSP, who fought the same way in many of his fights, but now GSP is known as one of the greatest fighters of all time, and everybody loves him, even though he was one of the most boring champions in UFC history. When a fighter is called boring for winning, it essentially means they need better competition, becomes champion. They prove now that they're multiple levels better than the best fighter in the world. If a fighter is called boring for beating a champion, that means they're not only better than the champion, they're way, way better than him. Because in order for a fighter to be boring, that means they have to have dominated the fight in some way or completely shut down their opponent's game. There cannot be a boring fight where it's competitive unless both fighters are being boring. And eventually, if they do it long enough like GSP did, they will eventually be called one of the greatest. So it's nothing new with Belal and Merab. Fighters who use wrestling have dominated this sport for most of its history until strikers got more precise with their shots, developed better grappling in order to be way too lethal for a wrestler to smother them for 5 rounds. Jose Aldo is a great example for a striker's evolution and is still the golden standard. Even an old Jose Aldo stuffed every takedown from Merab, something no other fighter has been able to do. But then eventually wrestlers got better with their striking while also not abandoning their wrestling skills, which used to be quite uncommon, right? Falling in love with your hands was a saying for wrestlers who learn how to strike and abandon their wrestling. Dan Henderson is an example of that. The new generation wrestler has learned to use their takedown threat in order to outstrike their opponent, even if their opponent is a striker themselves. I believe right now in the sport, a takedown threat is one of the best bases for striking. It can make even the most rugged punches land on good strikers. But the grapplers we have today are polishing their skills. Islam Makhachev is the perfect example. Sean Brady's another, but what does that mean for the sport? The pendulum swings back and forth. Now strikers have to evolve once again. MMA forces fighters to evolve to whatever the opposite style is. So a striker is going to have to learn better wrestling. A wrestler has to learn better striking. That's what the fighters have to do in order to get better. Strikers need to up their takedown defense and ability to get to their feet at a whole new level, since wrestlers learn how to strike much better than ever before. That is going to be difficult though. Grapplers inherently excel in MMA for a few reasons. One reason why grapplers dominate so much is because most of them have been training in some form of grappling much younger than fighters have been training in striking. Rarely do you see a high-level MMA striker who have been training their striking for a long time. Anderson Silva and Robert Whittaker are outliers in that. They have been training striking for a very long time. But when you look at Leon Edwards, Israel Adesanya, Alex Pereira, Sean O'Malley, etc., they all started training much later than the grapplers started grappling. Islam, Arman, Habib, Merab, Colby, Usman, Hamza, DC, Jones, Cejudo, all of these grapplers have been training for most of their lives. You see the domination and pure skill gap compared to their opponents who haven't trained as long. They usually meet their match against another long-time martial artist. Like when Islam fought Arman and Islam versus Volkanovski, Volk started MMA in like his 20s, but he's been wrestling for a very long time, even won national titles as a kid. So he's a long-time martial artist. Or Merab, maybe when he fights Umar, Usman when he fought Colby, Stipe when he fought DC, Hamza when he fought Usman, DJ when he fought Cejudo, etc. Martial artists who have trained longer will have a big advantage, despite whatever ranking they are, right? Bo Nickel can wash a lot of the ranked middleweights right now because of how long he has been wrestling. It is a reason why Americans, Brazilians, fighters from the Caucasus, they all do so well in MMA. They've been training the longest in effective martial arts. I would say the Chinese, Japanese, and Koreans because they also train like their whole lives, but the martial arts they train in are mostly ineffective for MMA. Now the Thais are effective, but they don't really care to come to MMA. They have their own sport. Instead, MMA fighters will learn from them, then bring that style into MMA. So in a way, the Thais have been very impactful for the sport. You might ask, what about the European fighters and Latin countries? The Latin America countries, their best talent usually go to striking sports. So like Latin America has their best combat sports athletes in boxing, whereas most Europeans are in boxing or kickboxing. Very recently, the best Europeans are coming into MMA. I think in like maybe 10 to 20 years, there's going to be a lot of high-level European MMA fighters. I would say the same for like the Latin countries, but I think they're just so ingrained into boxing. Or all their talent go to like football. Besides Brazil, because they started Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, the rest of them don't care to go to MMA. And when it comes to like some of the Asian countries, they have to do a lot of like relearning of martial arts because they train a lot in some of this like karate stuff, kung fu stuff, Tai Chi, and all this other martial arts that are ineffective in MMA. They have to relearn all that stuff. But you are starting to see it, right? You have some good fighters out of China in the UFC. Some of them trained in Sanda, which is a very effective martial art. Zhang Weili, I think, trained in it. That's like a militarized Chinese combat system. You have some good fighters in the flyweight division from Japan. Koreans have to do something with their taekwondo. Koreans dominate taekwondo, but it's hard to transition that to MMA without another base like Muay Thai. Those are the kind of martial arts that are effective situationally. Like they're not a good base for the sport, but some of their techniques can work in moments. Fighters who have a base in boxing, wrestling, Muay Thai, kickboxing, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, Sambo, and Sanda, these are very good bases for MMA. But when you go into the stuff like Kung Fu, when you go to some of the karate stuff, when you go into Judo, Taekwondo, it's very difficult to be a successful mixed martial artist while that is like your foundation. And I think that's what's holding a lot of the Asian fighters back a bit. Another reason grapplers do so well is because the MMA rule set favors their style. It's been slowly moving to being more balanced, but the cage gives certain advantages to wrestlers to spam takedowns, which will not change. No ground and knees and soccer kicks let wrestlers fail takedown attempts with little countering opportunities from the striker. Although ground and knees would also be used by wrestlers to finish a fight. If they get into like side control or the deserted north-south position, they let ground and knees, that position is going to be very much used in the UFC, but I think fans will also like that addition for wrestlers as well. The ground and knee rule is changing though, but still not perfect since wrestlers will be able to get to their knees or in their base and reject ground and knees. One massive inherent rule that favors strikers though is that every round starts standing. This is actually one of the biggest rules favoring any type of fighter. Can you imagine if the round started on the ground? Fans don't want to see that. Starting rounds on the ground would not be spectator friendly for most, but what about like starting rounds in the position that it was ended before? So like if round 1 ended with a wrestler in full guard, start round 2 in the full guard maybe? But what would be the point of rounds then? I guess you could just make it like one 25-minute round. So MMA is what it's always been. The most skilled, well-rounded fighters win. Strikers need to get better at grappling, just like how the grapplers got better at striking. If strikers don't evolve, they're going to be completely washed from their weight classes by fighters who can grapple and strike.